Spelunky is an action platformer roguelike, at least according to Steam. But Steam has also once listed Barbie Dreamhouse Party as a post-apocalyptic MLG horror masterpiece.
And now, the Game of the Year award goes to
Barbie Dreamhouse Party.
It was a good game.
Again,
It was a really good game.
And while both of these categorizations seem true on the surface, I would argue that Spelunky is actually one of the most strategic games I've ever played. And yes, I've played Sid Meier's Civilization.
Wait,
tell you what, lads, all hands on deck. No!
I would never argue against the current tags though. You can run, jump and Chris Pratt enemies. The game is random every run and will constantly shit on you, like a true roguelike. And though very primitive, this game does feature basic action. So on the surface, the game seems very simple. So what if I told you that this game is even more strategic than your wife trying to leave your marriage, and that all this strategy humbly begins with the ability to pick up a stone? The most basic concepts of strategy in Spelunky can be shown in the very first level of the game, where the player will undoubtedly run into one of these arrow traps. At this point, the player has to make a decision. Simply dropping down to the trap and taking the hit will result in the player taking 2 damage to their health from the arrow. This can also knock the player unconscious, and if you are really unlucky, into more danger. This is what the spunkers call the gamer test. If you are a true Sigma, you may have realised that the arrow trap is triggered by motion in front of it. So if you can recall your inherent human ability to pick up objects and drop them, you may have realised that you can actually disarm the trap by simply throwing a stone or other object in front of it. It doesn't exactly make you a genius for working this out, but by doing this, the game teaches the player a really valuable lesson that the environment can be used to your advantage. This naturally influences the player to always analyse their situation around them and make choices based on their surrounding. The game is filled with loads of different interactable items, such as stones, arrows, pots, and even treasure, but naturally, the thing that will most influence the player's choices are the hazards presented to them. After all, avoiding danger and reaching the end of the level is the main objective. Those main hazards being the aforementioned traps and a wide variety of enemies. Enemies in Spelunky are of course the main thing that provides that action flavour to the game. The enemies all have different behaviours that the player would be wise to learn in order to handle them effectively. For example, the spiders will not drop unless you are directly beneath them. Once they land, they will hop after the player. Snakes cannot walk off ledges, leaving them to walk left and right on the same platform forever. And bats will just fly after the player if you get too close to them. As you can tell, the enemies all have very simple and formulaic reactions to things. This gives the player the opportunity to study them and be able to calculate their next move based on what's in their way. This is also what separates Spelunky from other strategy-based games. Strategy games are almost always synonymous with turn-based action. XCOM, Civilization and Fire Emblem are some good examples of that. This is likely just a suitable design choice by the developers to allow the player time to process their next move and not overwhelm them with choices. As we know, Spelunky is all in real time. So what keeps Spelunky from becoming overbearing in its strategic gameplay and constant flowing decision making? Well, in most turn-based strategy games, there are many different game mechanics, behaviours, statistics and numbers that the player needs to constantly be aware of. This causes these games to sometimes come off as extremely overbearing, and mostly the tutorials don't do much to help by simply offering a brick of text for the player to slog through. This is especially true in a game like Civilization, where I don't think I'll be able to properly enjoy the game had I not been taught by friends or had already watched gameplay of it. Compare this to Spelunky, which offers a simple objective, simple enemies and behaviours, and things just seamlessly click into place. Down to its core, it's a platformer where you need to reach the end of the level, whereas a game like Civ is about politics, trade routes, and waging war against your enemies. I personally know which one I'd rather put in front of my nan. This easy to learn environment that Spelunky creates makes it possible for real-time action and platforming without it becoming confusing and overwhelming. But this doesn't make Spelunky some sort of baby game for Fortnite kids.
Among Us.
It's still really difficult and unforgiving. It just achieves that difficulty in a way that seems fair. The best way I can put it is, when you die, it feels like your fault instead of the game's. You'll still probably scran your mouse XQC style though. Just because something is simple to learn though, doesn't mean it lacks depth. Spelunky creates depth to its mechanics by allowing most objects to interact with each other in different ways. Enemies can trigger traps and set off explosives just like you can. This creates some really interesting scenarios where you can use enemies to your advantage, like getting a spider to drop down and take an arrow for you, or jumping on an enemy to access otherwise unreachable areas. Basically, if you think you can do something in this game, you probably can. And I really think most modern games neglect this philosophy. It's also the consistency of these mechanics that allow for preemptive planning and strategic thinking, such as the behaviour and movement of enemies. Randomization is obviously great for keeping a game fresh, but consistency is key in certain things to allow for planning and not to bombard the player with any unfair surprises. A perfect example of the balance between randomization and consistency in Spelunky is through the special level types. When entering a new level, there's a chance you'll get a unique type. For example, there are snake pit levels with 3 long vertical pits, obviously filled with snakes. There's spider levels filled with spiders, and dark levels with nothing but a torch to keep you going. Obviously there are more, but these are just a few of the ones given early game. Obviously these levels are randomly distributed, however there are some consistencies that keep the game grounded. For example, in the snake levels you can always find a pickaxe hidden at the bottom of the middle pit, allowing you to dig your way out. And in lights out levels, you can always find a hidden compass that points you towards the exit of the level, especially helpful in this kind of situation. Not to mention the fact that these level types significantly change your behaviour in order to survive. Lights out levels force you to slow down significantly as enemies and traps aren't easily visible anymore. And in spider levels, groups of dangerous large spiders spawn closely together, potentially forcing you to change your direction completely. Now, even though so far I've described Spelunky as a get to the end platformer, the game is not nearly that linear. The game often scatters items, treasure and damsels in all corners of the level, and this encourages the player to take differing routes, backtrack and change their plans. Damsels give you +1 to your health when you save them. Treasure can be used in shops to buy useful items, and these items can also just be found lying around in random locations. On the levels you'll mostly find bombs and ropes, but if you're lucky, items like the shotgun and jetpack can also be found. These benefits are still not essential, but are incredibly helpful in surviving the run to the end. It's this very high risk reward situation that creates the highly strategic gameplay, as just like more traditional strategy games, you have many choices at your disposal. You could opt to take the safest route to the end every time, or you could take the risk of getting as many items as possible to help the run. It very organically puts the player in situations where they put themselves in potential danger, even though they don't have to. For example, the damsels you can save in each level are incredibly beneficial. Having more health is always a good thing, but damsels can also be very high maintenance. You have to carry them to the end of the level, meaning you can't hold anything else like a stone or weapon. Even your whip is unusable until you drop them again, making the player almost defenseless. Unless, of course, you remember that this is Spelunky, and women are also a great weapon of choice. But to be honest, it's not exactly ideal, is it? Damsels aren't the smartest either. Many times I've left a damsel alone while fighting off an enemy to find they've just fell off a ledge into a pit of spikes. My point is, the game is really good at making the player measure out these high risk reward situations. The difference between Spelunky though and a game like Civ is that Spelunky is so fluid in its decision making that the feedback for your decisions are almost instantaneous. This feedback is easily communicated to the player by them getting hurt, dying, or accidentally pissing off a shopkeeper.
Hey, up and welcome to Gallagher's Corner. I take a leap, a shot today, such as my bloody brain, however, exploding like a volcano. Today you're not standing well.
Whereas in Civ, the feedback of a decision takes much longer to arrive, where it may not be until 30 turns later where you finally see the benefits or drawbacks of your decision. The thing is, I may seem to sound like I have it all figured out. I don't. 40 hours on Steam and I still haven't even seen the final area of the game. The game is incredibly difficult and unforgiving. The game throws so many obstacles at you, honestly sometimes it's hard to keep up. There's also a lot of one-shot kills such as the spikes and explosions. Here is an example of how quickly a run can end if you're not paying attention.
Hey, yo, the here. Oh, nigga!
My ears burn!
As you can see, the game is not afraid to slap you down, but it's not cheap either. The mechanics are easily learnt. Each time I die, I know why, and I know what to do next time I find myself in that situation. I also kind of love the fact that a run can end so quickly because it adds so much pressure to a run that's going well. It's the kind of thing that other good games do. It puts you on the edge of your seat and makes you a little nervous. It also encourages you to slow down and think about your approach a bit more, which is why I'm really surprised to hear that the sequel is apparently a lot faster paced. A game wouldn't be as strategic without mixing it up a little bit though and keeping you on your toes. Derek Yu, the creator of Spelunky, mentioned that when making the game, he felt as if traditional platformers like Super Mario were fun to play and control, but that they asked the player less of skill and more of memorization and learning the same level layout to reach the end. The roguelike's random nature allows Spelunky to ask the player to rely on their decision making and skilled platforming much more, because the player won't ever be able to memorize the ever shifting level layouts. Combine this with damsels, treasure, items, enemies and traps, and you have an interactive playground of objects that all interact with each other in really interesting ways. In doing this, Spelunky makes each and every run feel fresh and personalised to the player, and I think that's what makes it so fun to play. The game, of course, is a platformer at heart, but raw skill alone will not be enough to beat it. The game heavily leans into strategy game elements to make your approach, knowledge and planning just as important as your platforming. The point of this video? Spelunky is not just a platformer, action, roguelike. It's also a good game.
That can help. Staff only.